No, he's not.
Somebody better get on the motions.
You
How
guys
is it?
gotta
How's
pick
anything
up
gonna happen?
flat.
I don't know.
So it is 6 o'clock. So welcome to the Ellensburg City Council study session. It is April 3rd, 2023. So tonight we are talking about the Climate Commitment Act. And unless you want to introduce, we'll just go straight to Betty.
I would be
Just-
happy to
okay.
introduce. Good evening, Council. Heidi Barron-Sternaway, City Manager. Tonight you have before you a briefing essentially for ASMO study sessions on the Climate Commitment Act. And I just want to remember or help remind folks what this is at a very high level. So our state set a very aggressive policy goal to reduce carbon emissions across the state. And this is one in a series of policies that helps to bend the curve. And at a very high level, it's an emissions kind of cap and trade program. Some people call it a carbon tax that is essentially says you can emit carbon emissions, but you have to pay for it. And so this was legislation passed in 2021. And our staff have been working really hard to keep up with the rulemaking and all of the details about the implications of this policy for our natural gas utility and for our city and for our ratepayers. And so I'm going to kick this off to Buddy, who's been working very hard at understanding the details. You're probably going to get into the weeds a little bit, but please feel free to ask questions. We want people to leave with an understanding about what this is and how we move forward. Hey, Buddy, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Buddy Stanovich, Power and Gas Manager. I wanted to walk you through the slides I believe you have in front of you on the Climate Commitment Act, what it is, what Heidi touched on, and then how we see it affecting mostly the gas utility. And so here we go. So again, it was passed in 2021. It really establishes the cap and trade port, which is the comprehensive market-based solution to reduce carbon. And it took effect this year, January, officially. So the way that a cap and invest program works, some refer to it as a cap and trade. It sets a limit, which is the cap on the carbon emissions, and then requires businesses to, or utilities in our case, to obtain allowances and that are equal to their covered emissions. Ecology will be selling those allowances in auctions. And if you don't get it from Ecology, you get it from other agencies that have them, or businesses that have them, similar to stocks and bonds, like it says. The cap will be diminishing over time. As you can see there, the what the state's goals are and the various limits each decade. More so, the goals are to reduce to a percentage of the 1990 emissions levels. So I believe it's by 2030, 45%, and then of 1990 emissions level, then 70%, then 95 by 2050. This is a unique auction platform in that it's not so much the highest bidder takes all. Many parties will bid in the dollar amount per allowance and the number of allowances that they would like to receive. Nobody can see anybody else's bid. They then take that information, tabulate it, and start divvying out allowances. And basically it comes down to, at the end, the lowest bidder for the remaining allowances sets the price for everyone above. So if I could give an example, say there's 100 allowances and there's 5 bidders. First bidder bids in, and this is all at the same time. Nobody can see this. First bidder bids for 25 allowances at say $75. The next bids for 25 allowances at $50. The third, another 25 allowances, say at $25. And then, is that 75? Sorry, I'm reading transcription and trying to do math. Third bidder or the fourth bidder bids in for the remaining 25 allowances at $20. And bidder number 5 bids for 20 allowances at $19. Well, that bid at 20 set the price for everybody above. So they covered the full 100 of the allowances available. And so even the bidder that bid at 75, they're going to pay that $20 amount. The bidder that bid at the bottom, but there were no allowances left, they're not going to get any. So hopefully I didn't make that more confusing. Sounded like it in my head. So I can answer questions to that if you. There's essentially 3 different participants in this cap and trade program. There's covered entities, which is what the city is. There's opt-in entities, those that want to participate but aren't required to. And then there's general market participants. Those are the ones in the auctions buying and selling credits, but they don't really have a statutory obligation to comply with it. So the state deems 75% of the emissions in the state covered, and where we fall into it are natural gas distributed to homes and businesses. And then our electric utility will be affected by this. We just don't know all the details yet. You can see the non-covered emissions, the remaining 25% are below. Here's just kind of a checklist on what we've done. So we've submitted all the requirement documentations, reports to potentially get these free, no cost allowances that Ecology will be giving out. And we continue to report on what our emissions are from the gas utility side. And how this is going to work is Ecology is going to give us, the city's gas utility, no cost emissions that we can use to cover our compliance obligation, and also are required to consign a portion of it into the auction. So, and that will diminish annually over the next few years. They broke these up, the compliance periods, into 4-year sections, and that each year it'll make it more clear than the next slide, but just over the 4-year period, you're going to have to cover all of your emissions, but they allow you to step into it by just covering 30% of the prior year by November of the following year until you get the end of that 4-year period. Then you have to cover the remaining. So to give an example, November of next year, we would have to cover 30% of our 2023 emissions, and same for 25. But then as you get into 2027, you would have to cover the remaining 70. So you could cover 100% annually if you wanted to, or you could do this approach too, knowing that there are rules put in place into the auctions that make the price go up, and the allowances go down. So. Taking our COSA forecast and running it out, here's where we think our emissions will end up. This is just straight consumption today forecasted out. You can see here the gray bars at the bottom of the columns. Those would be the free, no cost allowances provided by Ecology. And the green would be the allowances that we would have to purchase. You can see the gray bars diminishing over time to where they go away.
So can I add to that? Can you go back to that for a second? So remember, when we were projecting out the cost of service, we did not account for the potential for the price to be raised, because ultimately this will translate to a higher cost for natural gas energy. And we did not project how that will bend the curve. We know if the costs are higher, our demand will reduce, but we don't know exactly what that cost is at this point, and what the price points are for people. And so we've actually invested, and this is maybe getting ahead of the game here a little bit, in a cost of service analysis to look at our impacts for this, and to look at projecting out what that sensitivity, the price sensitivity might be, so we can have a better idea of the curve of our use too.
Thank you. So, like I said, the program really kicked off this year. Ecology held the first auction in February, and this is the results of that auction. So Ecology offered almost 6.2 million allowances for sale. That settled at a price of $48.50. We didn't participate in this auction, but had we, that would have been the price we would have paid if we had bid properly. So what I did was I took these numbers and applied them to our customer classes on what we would have charged or added on to these various customer groups. So we were looking about a $1.5 million increase, and then spread across those different groups. That's how that totals. Any questions here?
I did have one question on the settlement price. Is that per metric ton? What is that measuring?
Essentially, yeah.
Well, since you opened it up, do we know, going back to that slide, how many bidders did not get allowances because they bid under $48.50? And what the price on the open market is for those folks?
So I don't know, to your first question, they've been very tight with the information about the auctions. Their Ecology is saying that down the road, they may start releasing a little bit more information, but they're keeping things pretty tight as of now as it develops. So if they did come out with a number of auction participants, I can't think of it off the top of my head, but I could look into it.
Just you saying that, I can think of good reasons not to, because that would allow the people who bought for resale a little more leverage on how much they should be charging.
Yeah. And then for that secondary market, I know they're trading, and I'm working on getting access to the data service that allows the trading platform. But I haven't seen it exactly. So I don't know what they're going for now, but I do know that they did come up for sale the very next day out on the secondary market. And they're going to fluctuate, I'm sure, every minute.
But very likely more than 48.50
One would assume.
because
yeah.
otherwise they can't make money.
Is there an expiration date on these credits? So say if we purchased all 6 million of those credits and held them for 10 years, are they expired after the 6 or 4 year? thing?
Not that I'm aware of. So just taking our average residential consumption, this is in looking at January's average bill, this would have equated to from $204 a month up to $245, so roughly a 20% increase. Again, on commercial, here's what the average bill was in January of this year, and then adding in that additional dollar amount. Same 20% increase. And so looking at this settlement price, the best data that we have available, running it out without any other changes, and the difference in the amount of no cost allowances that we're given and able to use or resell, this would be the rate impact that we would see going forward. But this has this is just assuming this price with the built-in mechanisms to increase it year after year that Ecology has stated, but no other market sensitivity or whatever. The green bar represents the total compliance obligation, and then the gray line represents the rate impact per 100 cubic foot of gas, the way that we meter.
So Betty, that's assuming constant use, correct? That's the same amount of gas over time. Correct. Yeah.
So I wanted to just share what I know about where these funds will go. So this is from Ecology's website, and they're predicting they will generate substantial revenue. I think that's evident on what we just saw, roughly $300 million in the first auction. But generally, the funds will be used to increase climate resiliency, fund alternative transportation, and help Washingtonians transition to a low carbon economy. So by statute, the funds will be directed into 3 different buckets. Now, there is the caveat with all of these that they are subject to appropriation by the legislatures. But we've got 3 accounts essentially: carbon emissions reduction account, climate investment account, the air quality and health disparities improvement account. This one, it really focused, this was the first bucket, is really focused more on transportation programs, grants, bicycle friendly streets, whatnot. We don't really know where a lot of these funds are going to go to, but this is high level what they are telling us. It's the general area they are. A lot more in this account, and this is split. You can see by the percentages, 75% towards the Climate Commitment Act account versus 25% to the Natural Climate Solutions account. This one didn't give as much granular detail, but this was the last bucket going towards monitoring and implementing the strategies to reduce health disparities.
So I did look, and Ellensburg is an overburdened community, so we will qualify for those funds. But I'm assuming it's like wood stove buybacks is gonna be the
Mhm.
the kind of strategies that we're gonna see.
And as far as we know, the dollars that come from a community may not be earmarked for that community.
Oh,
And
oh,
so
right, no.
these are broad
Just-
investments. Yep.
Yeah, but we don't know how they're gonna run those programs either. But it is, I mean, there's only 16 communities that are overburdened. And Ellensburg's one.
That's with all fall.
For air quality. From wildfires.
We're getting towards the end, but was a really timely study session because as you see on your agenda packet later, we're bringing forth an ordinance that changes some code language for you all to consider in that allowing us to purchase and sell carbon allowances and carbon instruments and whatnot. So those that will allow us to comply with this and actually make those market purchases and sales and buying carbon offsets and whatnot. And I threw this in here. This is just the way that our customers are broken out, who uses which customer groups use the gas. So you saw it in the bar chart before, but it just represents as a percentage.
More questions for?
Just thanks, Betty. So this is heavily focused on our gas utility, obviously. Is there a parallel structure for example, our transit operations? If we're currently doing a study to evaluate the transition from, carbon to non, but in the calculations of carbon loads and so on, where does that fit in, or does it?
So let's go back to this. It's a good question. I don't have so citywide, we were looking at our citywide emissions, carbon emissions. Those would affect the city's overall carbon. But in compliance under CCA, I don't believe Central Transit is specifically called out in having to comply with this. I could be wrong, but they would be affected by the gas and or diesel they purchase to run in the buses. So right now what we're hearing is a adder on top of gasoline and diesel at the pump, but on from the refiners. So
I was just trying to, what you're saying, if I understand it, is we're going to be assessed something based on our community generated pollutants, right? Like, in some form, whether it's a gas tax or something else. But I was thinking in terms of the things that the city of Ellensburg has control over, our running fleet or rolling stock, shop fleet and all that, vehicles, or transit fleet. And just sort of what are going to be and the grants are likely going to be what funds the transition downstream. But I was just curious how those contributors factor into our carbon load if they do it all, and maybe it's a different calculation.
So-
it's different. So did you want?
I can probably answer that. So we're going through this process with our sustainability and energy planning. And so we are looking at our municipal operations, so those things that we can directly control. And then we're also looking at our community emissions. And so in communities, transportation is usually a good chunk, about half or more sometimes of the emissions. The CCA doesn't cover that at this point. And so for our city operations, our building operations are generally the biggest emitters, essentially. Transportation is a segment. It's not included in the use of the CAP and Invest program. So the emissions aren't included, but the state is working on a number of different strategy fronts to help. And so again, you mentioned the the zero emissions plan we're working on. And if you look at one of the accounts that these dollars are invested in, it goes to some clean energy transportation programs. And so we can likely see a direct impact and benefit on that transportation sector for municipal operations, especially.
Okay, thanks. Thank you. And then similar, unrelated, sort of related question. So we're focusing on gas for obvious reasons, but as far as our electric consumption, given that the majority of our power comes from Bonneville and a large portion of that is hydro or some other semi non-emitting sort of source. If we hypothetically, if we had a large portion of our electric power supply coming from, say, coal-fired power plants, would that burden us as well? That would be. That's something we'd have to capture now.
Under a different act.
Well,
Right, different act, but that's part of the big picture, right?
yes, Nancy's right. It would on another act and this act. So
Okay.
Buddy, do you want to talk about what they're looking at for our electric generation and why right now it's not covered?
well, electric generation is covered under the CCA. Our electric emissions, there's a couple different calculations. We generally fall below the reporting threshold, so we haven't really had to nail this out, but we're roughly 4,000 to 8,000 metric tons a year. Like I said, depending on how you calculate it. There's a couple key, well, the biggest portion of this is under the CCA. It allowed for Bonneville to be what's called first jurisdictional deliverer. And Bonneville is deciding whether they want to be that or not. So if they're not, the electric utility should assume to get some free to no cost allowances to cover those emissions. If Bonneville chooses to become the FJD, the utilities would hand over their allowances to Bonneville and they would cover that. So there's a lot, really a lot of questions to be answered at this point, and how we are going to be affected on that side, we don't know. But much smaller level than this.
And I might add, and Buddy might want to fill in here. One of the challenges with this, it's absolutely new to the state too. And so a lot of the rules are being they're continuing to refine those rules. And that's been part of the challenge in compliance. We don't want to just guess. We want to make sure we're right. And I think we had looked at participating in the first auction, but we didn't have all the information the day that it was all due to make sure we were confident in moving forward. So that's why today we're going over this. We feel like we have a better handle on it. We have the authorization before you tonight for the participation through ordinance. And so we feel like we're in a better, more informed position. But the rules, they're continuing to refine those rules.
Go ahead.
So this is mainly focused on natural gas consumption, correct? So the grant that they just received to do prescribed burns to help prevent wildfires for this season, how is that going to affect our carbon emissions in accordance with this?
I don't think that it would. Yeah, the emissions that we're talking about that are covered, what would be the city's gas utility compliance obligation, are directly driven from the consumption of our customers' gas.
Anyone else?
I guess just one last one, and I know I don't want to go down the rabbit hole on this, but the city of Ellensburg, city of Enumclaw are the only two municipally owned gas utilities in the state, right? So the rules are written generically, so to speak, for all gas utilities. So are you seeing any, or is there any expectation that there will be some allowances made for those two municipal utilities that don't have a large user base to spread the cost out, as large of user base, we'll say?
We haven't seen any flexibility on that front.
So I do have one more question. I'm assuming. I think we've talked before about having a separate line item on bills when we start charging. I'm assuming that will be after we participate in the auction and we know how much we spent.
We would. Yeah, the next auction, it will be May 31st. We would know a week later, basically what it settled at. We would know what we spent at that point. And then we are hopefully going to be working with our COSA consultant to help work on that, to model it out, to build rates into, how to cover it. But because of all of the different compliance tools, that's something we need their help on. We only have to retire 30% by, the following November. How can we build these strategies in to soften the impact is what we'll be looking at. So the numbers I showed are a 12-month rate just spread out across consumption levels of the different classes. Then when you start adding in all of those other tools they've put in place.
In either the COSA or the sustainability plan, will we be looking at I guess the price will bring emissions down, but we could also be proactive and insulate. I mean, we've had efficiency programs forever. And I remember, we even did a study about what the potential for doing more is, given that a lot of our homes have already been insulated but there are other perhaps incentives for helping people buy heat pumps to avoid that gas charge and things like that. So I guess if we can avoid paying for the allowances if we help people transition. And I know that there'll be state money potentially, but we don't know if we'll get any of it. I'm just, what the cost to the utility for buying someone a heat pump versus the cost to the utility for buying an allowance.
Mhm.
Is that going to be analyzed?
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Okay.
And I would just add, we're doing a special focus on the energy piece of compliance. And then with mitigation measures, it's looking at what are the world of options available to help in the emissions. Again, a sustainability plan is about measuring and about mitigating emissions over time. So looking at the different policies that council could consider really across all of the sectors to help reduce. So, and again, the intent of the cap and invest system is to put a premium on the use and to ultimately drive the use down.
Could you go back to the slide? I'm curious about the slide that has the residential rate comparison, the average residential consumption. Yeah, so I'm just trying to put this into some context. So the 20% increase, that would be factoring in any additional cost burden, I assume, right? For the ratepayer. Is that essentially a one-time adjustment that would be repeated year over year, given the other graphs that are going like this? Or how is that going to work for the average ratepayer, given those numbers?
That's a good question. So what I did here the city's compliance obligation at 48.50, the settlement price be roughly 1.5 million. And so applying that to, breaking it down from metric ton allowance back to CCF, the way that we charge, and then just applying that cost adder. So this would have been January's bill. February's would have been roughly a 20% increase as well, but
So,
it was a 20%, annual increase.
so year one, 20% increase to cover roughly $1.5 million. And so basically we're consuming it, so we have to pay for it. Meaning the user ratepayers have to pay for it.
Mhm.
So spread it out. This is 20%. 2024 rolls around. How much, I know we can't predict, but ballpark, are we talking? Once you're sort of established at the threshold, are the annual increases beyond that smaller, or do they continue to grow exponentially? Given what we can see with our projections through 2036.
I would assume that they would go up just based on the way they built the tools in the marketplace
Okay.
to,
Okay, so meaning the $1.5 million that we have to recoup in 2023 is going to keep growing, and we're going to have to keep spreading that out. So it's going to just keep going up, right? Is that if the consumption stays the same?
correct.
That's,
So the only way to really bend, for the user, the only way to get out of that cycle is to get out of using gas. Insulation and heat pumps aren't going to save the day, right? We've got to transition into electric heat, right? To bend the curve. Seriously bend the curve. Is there another way?
I think,
For the ratepayer.
I think your assumptions are correct.
Well, I don't know. I'm just asking because somewhere the curve's doing this and we want it to do this, right? So
Mhm.
I'm just thinking about the sticker shock. One time is like, wow. 5 times might be completely unaffordable. So I don't know.
Well, I think communicating to our customers is going to be important, so that they know what's coming, so they can prepare.
Yeah, I agree with that, but I'm not sure that the average homeowner could afford a 100% increase in utilities over 5 years. You know what I mean? There's a practical reality and then, so.
and then to answer your question about listing the cost separately or the assessment separately, we are in the process of updating or upgrading our utility system. And we've talked about adding that as a line item. We certainly want to reflect that cost in how we communicate to our ratepayers.
But with our current utilities, the billing system, we can't. Okay.
I just have this is an elementary question. So there's a chance at those auctions that you may not get any. So at that point, then you're essentially forced to buy from these secondary brokers or whatever they would be called. And now, do they have a cap on what they're allowed to charge? Oh,
No, and we do have through November to invest this year, but we'd like to participate early if possible. So
So
we're
if you
not
didn't
forced
get any
into
of
that
the,
place.
so I think you said the end of May is the auction. If we didn't get some, then is there
Yeah,
2 more so you can
there's
keep?
quarterly, so there'll be 4 year
Okay.
ecology held auctions.
And we just have to buy it sometime this year.
But we don't have to
Oh.
this year. We have until November of 2024 to at least buy 30%.
Okay.
We still will be on the hook for the 100% of the allowances, but
And what if you went over
you can
your
bank them.
allowances?
Well, that's almost inevitable if you were to try to. Because we won't know our emissions until the last auction is closed, right? And so if everything stayed equal, it would be really hard to get that perfect. But no, they allow you to bank them. So
Okay, and then we use a different amount of gas every year depending on how cold it is.
Yeah.
And so we don't really know how many emissions we have because we don't know how cold it will be
Correct.
too. But they, like to Adam's question, they carry over
Yeah, you can bang.
if it's a mild winter. But if it's not, do we get penalized if we misjudged?
Well, one could think that way, that you'd be more penalized, but you just have to come up with enough allowances to cover your emissions regardless of the winter that you had.
That's just one last question. So in any scenario, if we have to come up with the money to cover our allowances or whatever, it has to come out of the utility fund. It can't, it's not a general fund thing, right?
We would be happy to take general fund.
So there's no,
That would be,
it didn't prohibit that, right?
Yes.
Okay.
let
that's
me
the
just
next-
clarify, please.
That's a conversation for another council.
Yes, just a reminder to the public that
There we go.
that our utilities operate as businesses, so the expenses that are assigned to those businesses stay within that fund, so.
Yeah. Thank you.
Great question, though.
Is there any more questions? Comments? Thank you, Betty. And now we're prepared to vote on anything later in the agenda.
All right, thank you.
Is there anything else or are we adjourned until 7 p.m.?
Nothing else from staff.
We will meet here at 7 p.m.